Hello and welcome to the next episode of my tutorial series, Keyboard and Theory Basics on Synthesizers. So to recap, we've already spoken about the names of the notes, how they correspond to the staff, the names of the blacks and the white keys, the concept of intervals and the names of those intervals, the concept of scales, the concept of the circle of fifths, of rhythm, and most recently we've introduced the concept of harmony, all of this including improvisation using one note, pentatonic scales, 7-note scales, the pitch bend and mod wheel, and adding chromatics. So how do we go from there to producing music in a more traditional form? Well, we've discussed chords and we've discussed the concept of voice leading. So the first question you might ask is, well, what do I do with that? Often, when playing with other musicians, you will discover that the way that they describe a song, as much as a melody, is in terms of the harmony. And the harmony is defined by the chords that are played with that song. Often, songs will have one chord per bar. Sometimes they have two, sometimes they even have more, but one is often the case. And this pattern of chords will repeat. So when you are improvising, one of the ways musicians understand what's going to happen is they describe the chord progression to one another, and then everybody follows the chords. Everybody plays their part to define harmony, and often each musician takes a turn playing a solo. That means they play the lead line that goes over the top of that. And that is something which is fundamental to how a lot of music is played. So let's step back to the last episode and think about the chords and the voice leading I discussed. Well, what we did was we played C, G, F, C. So that could be our chord progression, C, G, F, C. You will discover, though, that a lot of the time musicians don't talk about the absolute notes that they're playing and the actual chords that they're playing, but in scale degrees. So what do I mean by a scale degree? Well, when we spoke about what I called generic intervals define how far away from a certain root note another note is in terms of staff lines. So these correspond, if you count them from the root of the key, to the notes in that scale. So we could call in C major, this is the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and the eighth or first. And the reason we might call it the eighth is sometimes when we play something like an extended chord, this is the 9th, 10th, 11th. So that is a C minor 11 chord. So we refer to them by these numbers, and then therefore we refer to the chords who are rooted on those scale degrees by numbers too. So remember that I mentioned in a major scale the first chord you get is a major chord, that's known as the 1. The 2 is minor, the 3 is minor, the 4 is major, 5 is major, 6 is minor, 7 is diminished. So when somebody says to you, we're going to play a 1, 5, 4, 1. In the key of C major, the 1 is C major, the 5 is rooted on G, G major, the 4 is rooted on F, F major, and the 1 is back on C. So these are a series of major chords. So if we were counting the time, we'd probably be counting them in bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, repeat, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Usually you'd be playing something a little more interesting than that, but hopefully that illustrates how this goes round in a loop. Often they don't just say the numbers though. When this is written, it tends to be written in Roman numerals. And when it's written in Roman numerals, if the numeral characters are uppercase, it means that that chord is major. If they are lowercase, it means that chord is minor. So in this case, they're all major chords. It's 1, 5, 4, 1. So I'd write uppercase I for 1, 5 uppercase V, 4 uppercase I, V, and 1 uppercase 1. Imagine instead though I was playing 1, 6, 5, 4. So 1, 6 being minor, 5, 4. So in that case, uppercase 1, lowercase VI, lowercase 6, uppercase 5, uppercase 4. So that's a notation that you may see when referring to chord progressions. And once you're a little bit more comfortable, if that was, say I was playing that 1, 6, 5, 4, well in F, this is my 1, my 6 is going to be rooted up here, 6, 5, and my 4 here. So I can play the same chord progression rooted elsewhere, and functionally it would be equivalent, even though the key we're playing in would be different. So that's chord progressions described. Let's give an example of how you might play with those. So you may not have been able to see that, but on the F chord I actually played the B flat. So you might think, well, we're in the key of C. The key of C does not contain a B flat. Why would you play the B flat? Well, this comes back to compatibility of chords and scales. Specifically, any scale containing all the notes in the chord that you play is compatible with that chord at that moment. So when I played the F major chords, I used the F major scale. So I happen to know that that contains that B flat, so I felt empowered to play that. When you're just starting out, you may find it difficult to do this sort of thing and switching between scales, so don't rush to doing this. Feel free to stick to the pentatonic. For example, if I just play basically the same little pentatonic, C major pentatonic against each chord, wasn't quite the chord progression, but you could see I stuck to the same melody effectively, just going up and down the scale, meandering, and played a series of chords underneath it. One of the reasons why that works surprisingly well is because I mentioned previously, you can think of the notes of a melody as being an extension of the chord played underneath them. So when I play a G on top of a C major chord, well, that's just another G. If I play an A, you can imagine that I've turned my C major into a C major 6 chord. That's a more interesting harmonic context. I play my G major with an F, that's turned the chord into G major 7. So there is interest to be had playing surprisingly repetitive melodies against changing chords, because you're changing their harmonic context. Okay, so that's quite a sort of lot of complexity that I've discussed there, so I'm going to try and talk about some simplicity now. Think about the voice leading that I was describing previously. I was talking about imagining each of the notes in the chord moves to another position when I play another chord. In fact, if I use the same finger, it's even easier. So these three. So you can watch any one of those fingers and you can see the journey it's taking. And the journey it's taking is quite a simple journey. So given that chords are simply, in this context, selected from the scale, and I pick inversions to try and make the voice leading sound good. Well, I have another option. I have an option to pick an arbitrary selection of notes from the scale and then move them to adjacent scale tones. So in other words, I'm not thinking about the chord that I'm playing, I'm simply making voice leading that looks like it makes sense. So let's say I started here. Let's say I want to move this one down one, this one up one, and this one up one. Kind of a funky sound, but perfectly usable. And then let's say I'm going to move them all up. I'm going to move the bottom one up and the bottom two down. I'm going to move them all down. So even though I didn't think about the chords that I was going to play, I managed to make a meaningful set of voice leading and consequently a meaningful selection of chords. This is, to me at least, it was quite surprising when I realized that this was possible. And though often when I compose, I might think from a theoretic perspective and start by an understanding of a progression that I want to make, often what I'll do is I will play and then I will apply the theory knowledge that I have to analyze the progression that I've made. And to me, that's one of the important things about theory. People worry that theory will control their music. Theory is not necessarily a prescriptive language, but rather a descriptive language. We use theory to describe what is being done and to contextualize it. It does not tell me that in the C major scale, I can't play B flat. So why would it? Theory doesn't care. Theory just says that B flat is not super strong, not super weak in that harmonic context. So, how do we translate this into something useful? Well, the way that I would say we can translate that is we can improvise a chord progression in a scale. This synth has 6-note polyphony, so I'm going to try and not play too many notes. I'm always tempted to put in these 6 8-note voicings, and then if I go to play a melody, it's not going to work. But what I'm going to try and do is draw a parallel with what might happen in a production context. So what this means is I'm not going to be looking to play melody and harmony at once. Instead, what I'm going to be looking at doing is to play some harmony, and then I'm going to play melody over the top of it. So hopefully it can illustrate. Imagine the person playing the harmony was another musician. Then you could be playing with that musician, and then you could be getting some of the improvisation that I've been trying to illustrate could become available to you. So let me turn the metronome on. C minor. So I'm counting 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Metronome off. Okay, not the most interesting of things, but now I have a harmonic foundation. Now I have a harmonic context to listen to and build some music on. So let's experiment in the C minor pentatonic scale. I'm waiting for it to come back round. 3, 4. Okay, so hopefully you could hear that I had a slight problem there in that I didn't actually have a drum rhythm playing at the same time, so I couldn't quite hear where the beat was going, because all I'm hearing to hint at the beat was one note per bar, and I was trying to look at my screen, which is giving me a preview of what's happening, but there is a delay with what appears on screen, so I couldn't visually follow the metronome on the screen. I had to visually follow this physically. But apart from that little glitch that happened, I think that was fairly interesting. That was not a series of chords that I wrote. That was not a series of chords that I used theory to describe. It was a series of chords that I just played, thinking about leading the voices in an interesting way. And I think that is very important when it comes to applying the skills that I've described. It's about understanding the available notes, the available chords, the available harmony, and how well they come and they fit inside and outside what it is that you're trying to do. So I guess to finish up this episode, I'll try and do some more improvisation. I might try and change keys a few times. F minor, G minor, A, B minor, C minor, D minor, E minor, back to C minor. So hopefully there you could see that having that rhythm playing gave me something to latch onto and keep things flowing rhythmically. And hopefully it also illustrated that I'm clearly not thinking circle of fifths, these notes, these notes, these notes. Though you can know theory intellectually, knowing theory in theory is insufficient to play. So bridging the gap between your theoretical knowledge of theory and your practical knowledge of theory comes practice. And for me, I probably spent my first 6 months playing piano just practicing scales up and down and practicing the diatonic triads and their inversions. So I'd go only up a couple of octaves and then I'd go. So I'm playing the inversions, inverting up the keyboard. I'd be practicing things like that. And then I'd try and do that with 7th chords. And then I'd do it with 9th chords. And I didn't really do it with 11th chords. But that was really the bread and butter of what I did to develop the kind of fundamental skills that I used. And I discovered that though initially I had to spend that time of thinking, okay, G major has 1 sharp, but I want G minor, so I need 3 more flats, so I've got 2 flats, so that must be this one and this one, so. And then in order to convert that to a pentatonic, I skip the 2nd, so and then I skip the 6th. There was a time when I had to do that, but that time will pass and you will simply remember where the notes are, and more than remembering where they are, you will feel where they are. In fact, this keyboard I find a little confusing because it has the F at the base, so sometimes I find myself going for a C chord and playing that, a C minor chord, because I sort of reference the end of the keyboard. But in any case, I think I have demonstrated what I set out to demonstrate. I think I've provided enough information that looking up a few other resources as reference material and combining it with what I hope you've learnt with me throughout this series, you should be able to meet some musicians, listen to them say, we're going to play a 2-5-1 in the key of A. Understand what that means enough to play to some extent, and the extent to which you can play with them is determined by how much practice you've put in. So if you haven't practiced very much, maybe you just do a one-note improvisation. You only play in the A. Maybe you play the A and the E, right? The 1 and the 5. Maybe you play the A minor pentatonic scale. Maybe you use the full A diatonic. Maybe you introduce a blue note. Maybe you introduce other chromatics. Maybe you play a glissando. Use your pitch bend, use your mod wheel. But those are not skills which you can learn to apply simply because I told you about them. You will learn to use them by using them. So what I hope you do is experiment with some of what I've taught you about chords in your produced music, experiment with some of what I've taught you about playing musical lines, playing bass lines, playing lead lines, playing accents, experiment with rests, experiment with rhythm, experiment with time signatures. And when you combine all of that, you will hopefully develop a channel to convert the sounds or the concepts that you had in your head into something that you can really play on keyboard and put in a piece of music. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I hope you'll join me for some more videos in future. But in any case, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.